All right, guys. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm doing a talk this morning, obviously, after Red Man and Method Man last night, which is kind of a rough schedule. So I appreciate all of you for actually getting up this morning to roll in here, even my teammates, because we're one moose. But anyway, so I'm doing a talk on related to vulnerability management. We're a shooting gallery. Now what? Evolving from a tactical checklist response to a proactive strategic process. That's what I'm doing. So let's get into it. All right, there we go. So who am I? I'm a senior security consultant for Rapid7. I've been in information technology for a little over 20 years. I have a Unix system administration background. I started out with basically I was working at ISP as a dial-up technician. So I don't know if you guys have been around long enough to understand what that is, but some of the old school guys know what that is. Basically, you tell people that have Windows 3.1 to reboot so that they can connect to the internet. So I started out there, and there was a Unix system administrator that was there that ran the shell server because it used to hand out shells, which, whoa, that's awesome, right? So they used to hand out shells back in the day, and I told him I wanted to learn Unix, and he said, okay, no problem. So he set up a FreeBSD box. And said, if you can get root, I'll teach you Unix. And so he gave me a shell, and I started playing around, learned it, got root in 2 weeks because I was a Windows guy. And so basically his goal was, if you can learn Unix in 2 weeks to get root, you can learn Unix in general, right? So anyway, I'm just an average Joe, right? I didn't drop an O day yesterday. But what I do have is I have like a huge passion around security and around vulnerability management in general because I come from a system administration background and I care about protecting the systems. And this is not going to work. So I'll go there. So what do we see? Basically, what I see and what I have seen in my roles as a vulnerability management specialist and also in my security consultant role is that we get these pen test reports that come back to the vulnerability management teams, and they come from third parties, they come from internal red teams, they come from internal pen testing teams. And these reports come back and they come to management first, or executives, they come to management, and then they come to you as the vulnerability management guy. And the perspective that's set on these reports is pretty interesting. And the reason is because we hire these people or we have these internal teams to find our holes, right? To find the bugs and find the issues within our systems. And so since that's their job, they make a show of it. That's what they do. I mean, they don't come in and say, oh, hey, I found this one vulnerability. It was really cool. You should go check it out. No, what they do is they come in and they say, I got root and I owned you and I took over 4 of your systems and I got this PCI data. So they make a show out of it. And so it creates this perspective of the reports and the findings report that looks a lot like this. Right? So you look up and you say, this is the report. It's awful, right? We're going to die. There's holes everywhere. And so because of that, you get this response that doesn't necessarily line up with good security because it's a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's just like if somebody has a trauma issue, you're going to try to fix the trauma, but you forget that the guy's got cancer too, right? I mean, so you forget the other items that are related because you're so focused on these single bullet holes. So what are some of the common pen test findings that get a lot of attention? We can default passwords. That's a big one, right? But guess what? They exist, and they're everywhere. That's reality. There's very few places that I have gone in my roles everywhere that I have not found we can default passwords throughout the enterprise. It's there. They exist. OpenFTP, another big one. Printers supply these, right? So there's a lot of devices out there that come with FTP built in, and it's usually open and allows anonymous access. Open file shares, another one that's very common, luckily because of Windows, but obviously Windows has started to mitigate some of that, so by default they're not sharing files, but users are still really able to share out files on file shares. An old critical vulnerability. This one's near and dear to my heart as a vulnerability management specialist. I hated seeing this show up on a pen test report, right? Because if my company said something was a critical vulnerability, it's supposed to be gone, right? It's not supposed to be in our environment. Especially for larger, more mature programs that spin up special projects strictly to get rid of a single vulnerability. you still find them later in a pen test report. Why? So network segmentation vulnerability, I included this because a lot of people forget that vulnerability management is not just about patching. It's about managing all vulnerabilities within the enterprise that you're working in. And segmentation vulnerabilities is an architecture vulnerability. It's still a vulnerability, though, because it allows people to traverse VLANs that they shouldn't be traversing, or networks or firewalls or things of that nature. So I included it because I wanted to kind of remind people in vulnerability management that it's not just about patch, right? There's other things involved in vulnerability management. So what are the common pen test finding responses? So in my experience, I have found there to be 3 common responses. And the executive response is always my favorite because this is what they do, right? They get that huge pen test finding report that's like this thick on their desk, and they start looking at all the data because they always take a screenshot of like credit cards and blur out the credit card numbers. And then they always take a screenshot of user IDs of system administrator passwords, right? So they have all of this and they present it to the executive. And the first thing the executive does, at least that I've seen, right? The executives I've dealt with, they're like, oh, really? We're going to die. I have to go to legal now. I have to talk to legal about getting ready for an attack because we're going to obviously get hacked. And, you know, sometimes the ones that I've dealt with, they have forgotten that we can do this and this is okay. These vulnerabilities have existed for a period of time. This report is here to tell us what vulnerabilities we have. So that's okay. They're going to find stuff. That's what we pay them to do. The management response underneath the executives is because my executive is freaking out, I need to take this list and fix everything on it really fast. And so what they get into is they get into this mindset of a checkbox list. They take that finance report, they drop it into an Excel spreadsheet or a Microsoft project, right? And they literally just start going off and marking them off the line because they want to go back to their executive and say, we fixed those. We fixed those issues. Operations team response. Now, I can say this because I was on operations. So don't ask me. I'm just the admin, right? So even though I was really involved in security and had a lot of passion around security, being a Unix administrator for 15 years, I realized that the people around me weren't quite as passionate about security. And so this was actually a common response even when I was working in Unix administration. And I always had a problem with this response. So I'm actually working on some other stuff to talk about that and deal with operations people too. So, but anyway, so this is a common response that I dealt with, is that don't ask me, I'm not security, you just tell me what to do, right? So how about something that's a little bit different from that? Let's look at something that's a different approach. Let's not just check the boxes, right? Let's not just take that list and just go one vulnerability at a time on one asset. That's not the way we need to handle this. So what should we do? We should review the findings. So step back, take a look at the list, take a look at the report, and just review them, go through them and take a look at them at a higher level. Define the vulnerability types that you see. So take a look at the report and say, okay, look, this one is this type of vulnerability. This one is this type of vulnerability. This one is this type of vulnerability. When you do that, you're starting to classify and remove the tactical and go into strategic. Because now you're taking it up a level, right? And you're going to be able to take a look at it more holistically, and you're going to be able to remediate this at a higher level. So yes, actually, so in the pen test reports, this is one of the things that I've experienced. I love the third-party pen tests especially because they do this. They come in and they do the strategic and they list out each of those, right? And they say, hey, this is this type of thing. But what I have found to be the response to that is that they don't stay in the strategic, right? Not the pen test reports always present that, right? They always present that. They always say you should look across your enterprise, right? They tell you that, but they tell you that after they've presented the findings. And what happens is people get stuck on the findings, right? They just literally deadbolt right there. I can't go any further. And so sometimes they don't respond in the way that the pen testers tell them to. But as the vulnerability management team, the one that's doing the response to these tests, that's our job, is to help keep those executives on track, right? And that's also our job to keep our management on track so that we do look at those pen test findings. And sometimes when you have a red team operation, right? So I was working at a corporation that's pretty big, and we had our own red team. And in the red team response, they did not have a process to do this. It was single findings. And so that, again, that's a vulnerability management thing. Okay, look, you're giving me single findings, but we really need to take this up to another level. Good question, though. So then let's identify these vulnerability instances. So what I mean by that is, obviously the pen test report and the red team operation finds them on single assets, right? But our job as vulnerability management is to take that up to the next level and say, where does this exist in the enterprise? We should be looking for this everywhere, right? And then finally, of course, you put it into the life cycle of the vulnerability management program. So sometimes what you'll find is that you need to actually have separate reporting related to findings from the red team operation or from that third-party pen test, because you're going to want to dev out those vulnerabilities and you're going to want to talk about those responses. So you'll find that you want to look for those again, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to get another question, especially 6 months later when that third-party pen test comes back in to do the pen test. And are we prepared for them, right? Did we get rid of those vulnerabilities that we had last time? And you can go back and pull those reports in that life cycle, right? So let's take those sample findings that I had and let's kind of walk through them. So again, we had the weak default passwords, we had the open FTP server, we had the open file shares, we had the old critical vulnerability, we had the network segmentation vulnerability. So if we look at that and we go up a level and we say what's tactical, what's strategic, we can say the weak and default passwords obviously is tactical again, right? I mean, that's single item, single box if we see those. The strategic response is policy enforcement for that one. Obviously, we're not enforcing our policy, which every good security policy says change your password, right? I mean, we've even got t-shirts that say change your password, right? So every good security policy is going to have change your password, change your defaults, and also have strong passwords. And so the response to that is that we're not doing a good job of enforcing our policy, right? So let's step back and let's say, why not? And let's try to review the policy and review why it is that this policy is not getting implemented. Open FTP. This one is configuration. It could be policy because you could have a policy against FTP servers specifically. A lot of security policies for medium-sized and small companies don't necessarily include that specific detail. But so this is really configuration. Eliminate the anonymous FTP access, right? At least have some type of authorization required. So that you can be able to access the files that you need to if you need to use FTP and basically attack and not allow the attackers to utilize the default anonymous passwords. Open file shares. So I included this both in policy and configuration because if you don't have a security policy regarding file shares, you probably should. And so that's going to be a policy issue. And then configuration, because if you do have a policy that says you can have file shares on your network, then you want to make sure that those are configured properly. And you want to make sure that you have the permissions locked down, you have the ACL set up in such a way that only certain access is allowed. So old critical vulnerability. This is a bane of mine again, like I said. I never wanted to see these show up on pen test reports. And I said, so why is this? And what I found in the role that I was in previously is that we didn't have a good cyclical process to come back and look at these critical vulnerabilities that we spun up all this effort on to remediate. So we were a large company and we would spin up special projects to remediate critical vulnerabilities because we had Poodle, we had, Heartbleed, we had Shell Shock, etc. And so what I had found is that we did not have the process to come back and look at those again on a cyclical basis and still keep them prioritized. So they would end up on the report with all the rest of the vulnerabilities. And that's not something that I felt was good, because if we as a company decided that we needed to spin up a special project, then we should continue spinning up that special project, just reiterating it every time that we find this vulnerability somewhere else. And then we needed to find out why it's showing up, right? Is it showing up in our builds? Is it showing up in, system configuration after the build? How's this vulnerability coming back in? Network segmentation. So this is security architecture. But again, this is something that vulnerability management should be involved in. You're going to have, if you're a large corporation, you're going to have a security architecture team, but that doesn't mean that vulnerability management is not plugged into it. You do want to have an understanding of what's going on in the network architecture, because that's part of understanding the controls, right? That's in place. So again, how do we identify these instances? This is pretty simple, right? For the individual vulnerabilities that you can scan for, like weakened default passwords, open FTP, open file shares, critical vulnerabilities, you can obviously configure scan templates in any of your vulnerability scanners, and then you can produce reports that are necessary in order to separate these out and to come back to these and look at these again as part of your life cycle. Security review of the network architecture. So again, I like to stress this one because when I worked in vulnerability management, it was not something that was common in the companies that I was in for the vulnerability management team to get down in and sit with operations for a few minutes, and network operations especially, because network operations teams that I worked with, they tended to be in their own little space, especially if they manage the firewalls. And that's actually outside of security, which that happens at some companies. They really get protective when security sits with them for a minute. But that's okay. You can let them be protective, but just you have to be able to work with them, and you have to be able to sit with them and say, look, I need to understand the controls that we have in place, and I need to make sure that we can make sure we eliminate the vulnerabilities related to that. So take a look at the firewalls, look at the firewall rules. There was one place that I worked at where from the pen test report, we had found that the attacker was able to pivot from one VLAN to the other. They weren't supposed to be able to do that. We get back and look, and I sit with the architecture team, or the network architecture team, and I ask him to pull up the firewall rules. He pulls them up, and it's in listening mode. I said, well, good job there, guys. So again, even, and honestly, I noticed after I did that, and after I sat with the network architecture team, they actually wanted me to come back. They wanted me to say, hey, you know what? You found that other thing. Can you look at this other stuff? Here, take a look at this. We're about to build out this VLAN. Does this make sense? And so you can build that relationship with those operational teams, and then you can get this kind of response so that you can eliminate the vulnerabilities before they exist. All right, so what do we do with all of this? Well, we boil it all down, put the balls in the funnel, and we put it into the vulnerability management lifecycle. Again, you want to basically take these reports, you want to put them in, have some specialized processes around them so that you can come back and respond to them in a manner in which there's prioritization that you need on those items. And then you want to make sure that you have it as part of your life cycle to come back and review these items. You want to come back and review them again, because your executive, your manager, they're going to ask in 3 months and in 6 months. Okay. They're going to come back in 3 months and 6 months. And they're going to say, hey, we really want to know where we're at with these issues, especially if you've told them we need to take this up a level, and we need to go across the enterprise and remediate these vulnerabilities. In the end, why are we doing all of this, especially in vulnerability management? Because we want to keep the boss happy, right? As long as this guy's smiling and has a nice fat cigar, he's happy. And so that's why we do it. Not only that, but I mean, we have a passion around it. That's why we're here, right? And that's pretty much it. Thanks, guys.
What have you been using for all that tracking stuff? Because I do a little too much VM, and the biggest problem I have is tracking.
Yeah. Yeah. So automation's my friend. So for tracking that, what I would do is at least at several companies that I worked at, we could actually put in automated reports. And some of the tools these days have automated reports. So you can actually have it where it'll spit out those automated reports back to you, or you incorporate those things into dashboards, right? So if you have a dashboard on your vulnerability management software, then you would incorporate that there so you could track your individual remediation processes for those items, right? Does that make sense? Or okay. Okay, yeah. No, I definitely would love to talk. Yes.
The question of the day.
Here comes one moose.
How did you get root? Did he put you in the pseudo-doors?
Okay, yes. No, he didn't put me in pseudo-doors. That would have been awesome, though. No, and it wouldn't have taken me 2 weeks, hopefully. But then again, I was a Windows guy, so no. Actually, so So I got root because basically, I'm a Windows 3.1 technician, Windows 95 tech, sitting on the phone answering, telling people to reboot. And I basically was like, okay, well, so how do I do this? I started searching, and it was, I think, Alta Vista at the time, which, again, ridiculous, okay? But what I ended up doing is I did what everybody else did at the time, and I got on AOL and got into chat rooms, okay? I know like now AOL is like a bad thing, but back in the day, it was either that or nothing. Okay. At first, until I found out about IRC. And so I found out, oh, whoa, there's these other chat rooms that nobody knows about, right? They're all secret. So I get into IRC. And got into BBSs, which were still around at the time. And so I ended up getting into the chat rooms because I was using AOL Hell, right? And all these other tools to like knock people offline and, just screw with people. And so I basically just got into the scene. And so I got into a couple IRC chats where you could ask for exploits, but they wanted shells. Well, we had a shell server. So I was able to get some shells handed out. And one of the guys sent me this exploit, and he said, look, this works on FreeBSD 2.0, which is what we were running. And he said it was related to SSH, actually. But it was OpenSSH installed on FreeBSD because OpenSSH was still new, right, back then. And so there was an issue there. And basically, I got the shell code, which was in Russian. I'm sure you guys have dealt with that, okay? So I got the shell code, which is in Russian. And so I didn't even know about GCC. I was like, what the hell is this? A compiler? But I got some guy that basically told me through the IRC, this is kind of how you do it. I don't know if it's going to work for you. And I said, okay, cool. So then I started reading man pages like crazy. And I said, okay, how do I do this? How do I do a make, right? And so basically that's what I did. And finally I got a executable. I executed it and root prompt. And I was like, whoa. And then I was hooked, right? That's game on. And so then from that point forward, I always was trying to get root somewhere, whether legally or illegally. But at that time, there was no laws, so I was good. But basically, that's how I did it. And it took me about 2 weeks because I had to get into the scene and I had to form those relationships to get the exploit. Yeah, because it's not like you could go to exploit.db, right? Like you can now and just go pull an exploit. It's not that easy. So yeah, good question though. Thanks.
Back in my day.
I look, okay, I'm not that old. I'm not that old, but I feel old, okay? Especially after last night.
So I was going to ask, if you're setting up and starting a VM program today for all of that, what's your first hire for your team? Are you going to go network person? Are you going to go systems person? Are you going to go scripter who can automate everything for you? If you're starting it up, where's your first angle of like, this is what I need?
Yeah, so my view might be biased because I'm an operations guy, but I truly believe that having that operations experience really helps you, right? Especially when you're talking. I found that on the teams that I worked on, I would come in and those guys would not be previous operations guys. And I would come in with previous operations experience and I could build that relationship, right, with those ops teams. And so I could get a response that was completely different than what those guys were getting, right? And so the ops guy, the guy that did ops or knows ops and then moved into security, or like me that was involved in security but just did operations, right, did operational things. I think that's a good first hire because you can form those relationships and then build those processes because they know what it takes to actually fix those things, right? So that's kind of a good first hire if you're building out the team. I mean, in my opinion, obviously. Yeah. I got this. I got this time. So basically, we got the next guy up. So, but you can definitely talk to me afterwards. Yeah, and you too. Thanks. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. That would have been ridiculous to find out. And actually, I never asked and I never looked. Now that's a question in my head. Was I in suitors the whole time?
You're going to go to the grave.
I am. No, actually, here's the crazy